the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. A day of national dialogue, action, and concrete proposals for government is being held in Venezuela today, called by President Nicolas Maduro. Social movements and political leaders of the Bolivarian Revolution are in more than 2,500 communities throughout the country to discuss improvements in the government's plan for the homeland for the years 2019 to 2025, as the country continues to face the U.S.-led blockade. Assemblies and consultations between citizens and government representatives are taking place and will continue tomorrow. The first stage of the debate process is aimed at the grassroots. 5 thematic lines will be discussed: peace, economy, popular and revolutionary transformation of the state, social protection of the people, and socialist city, in terms of establishing effective strategies which will meet citizenship demands.
This is not something small that the President of the Republic has planned. On the one hand, it's to stop the coup perpetrators together with the people, and the other, it's to say we know our problems and difficulties, but it's through revolution that we solve our problems and our difficulties.
And the Vice President for Social and Territorial Development said that each social sector will discuss different proposals to present to the government during the day of dialogue.
We want these meetings to have 3 levels and 3 stages of discussion. We are beginning with discussions in popular assemblies. They are taking place not only in the capital cities of each state, but in all municipalities. Health workers and educators are discussing at health centers. Small villages are discussing. Workers are discussing in their workplaces. The whole base is discussing today. The units of battle Hugo Chavez. Everybody is discussing where they live, where they work, and where they fight.
Earlier, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro oversaw military exercises held by cadets at the Bolivarian Military University. The president arrived accompanied by the defense minister, Vladimir Pedrino Lopez. The cadets of the National Armed Bolivarian Forces explained tactics to President Maduro, who also held an inspection of the training facilities and military equipment for the defense of the nation.
I like to congratulate all the academics, directors, and all of the working teams for the excellent job they have done. To have 3,770 cadets learning for 24 days, the tactical methods of revolutionary resistance corresponding to our strategical concept of anti-imperialist people's war.
One of the headquarters of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela in the Chavista stronghold of the San Agustin neighborhood of Caracas was attacked by supporters of the Venezuelan opposition. Perpetrators set the building on fire and left printed signs with threats including strong sentiments against Chavista collectives, while at the same time praising Oscar Perez. Perez was a figure who was deemed a terrorist by the government for his actions in hijacking a helicopter and attacking the Supreme Court with grenades in 2017. Telesur contributor Mike Fox is in Caracas and brings us a report from outside of the headquarters.
I'm here in the working-class Caracas barrio of San Agustin, where last night around 3 a.m. violent opposition groups set fire to the local headquarters of Maduro's United Socialist Party of Venezuela. They lit several tires on fire and left threatening messages. Residents who lived upstairs, there's roughly 2 or 3 dozen residents that live upstairs with children and grandparents. Several of them came downstairs to put out the fire. This is just the latest in a string of such attacks around Caracas that have taken place against kind of pro-Maduro organizations like this. There was also a fire at a building in the Comuna Indio Caricuao. That happened literally on the same day as the big May Day marches, Maduro's big May Day march. and also, the opposition march just a day after Guaido's attempted military uprising. So this is a clear sign here that this is not just a peaceful opposition, as we oftentimes hear from the United States, but this is an ongoing kind of attacks on people who are in support of the Maduro process and groups and organizations that are aligned with the Bolivarian movement.
That was Mike Fox in Caracas. Peaceful activists have gathered outside of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington in support of the Embassy Protection Collective, which has been holding a live-in for about 3 weeks with the permission of the Venezuelan government. The solidarity on the street comes in response to threats by the right-wing opposition and its supporters, who've also gathered outside and who've carried out acts of vandalism, including the dismantling of a security camera. The embassy protectors have condemned the aggression of the right wing, which has been hurling sexist, racist, homophobic, and transphobic attacks against activists and journalists alike who've been covering the events. Meanwhile, supporters of the Bolivarian government continue to denounce the failure of the United States to abide by Article 22 of the Vienna Convention and protect Venezuela's diplomatic offices. At least one embassy protector has been arrested. Social movements, political parties, and trade unions have marched in the Basque Country in support of Venezuelan sovereignty and against the United States intervention. The marchers carried Venezuelan, Cuban, and Basque flags in rejection of the failed coup in Venezuela on Tuesday, April 30th. They also expressed their solidarity with the people of the Bolivarian nation and its revolution. One of the unions marching, the Basque Nationalist Workers Committee, released a statement prior to the march. It expressed its concern for the attempted coup against the legitimate government of Venezuela. The union also reiterated its support for the Bolivarian Revolution, as well as for finding a peaceful solution to the situation through dialogue. And members of the Venezuelan opposition tried to deliver a Freedom Operation document to soldiers in Caracas. However, the Bolivarian armed forces weren't interested in its contents. Instead, they opted to dispose of the document in the way they thought most appropriate.
No, pero ¿sabes qué, hermano? Que inclusive uno tiene hasta familia militar, hermano. Que pasen buen día.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. This week, thousands of social leaders were in Bogota in what was called a refuge for life. They demanded guarantees to life and freedom, as they say that the Colombian government of Iván Duque has breached a number of promises. Afro-descendant communities, campesinos, and indigenous people held a number of actions to highlight issues including the assassinations of social leaders, forced displacement, and disappearances in their territories. Earlier, I spoke with Ben Norton, a journalist with the Gray Zone who is in Bogota, Colombia, covering the mobilizations this week.
So I came here to Colombia to report on what should be all over the English language corporate media, but of course is largely ignored, and that's the largest crisis of assassinations of activists in the entire world. Colombia has the dubious honor of having the highest rate of assassinations of human rights activists, more than any other country. And since 2016 in November, when the government of the former President Santos signed a peace agreement, a historic agreement with the FARC, and the FARC agreed to demilitarize and became a legal party, since then, more than 550 peace activists and social activists from different groups have been assassinated, including more than 130 members of the FARC itself. So former ex-combatants who agreed to put down their weapons and sign a peace agreement with the government, more than 130 have been assassinated, including some of their family members. So I came here to report on that. And Refugio Humanitario is an event that was over a series of 5 days that was highlighting the crisis here of assassinations, not only targeting former guerrillas from the communist groups, but also targeting indigenous activists, Afro-Colombian activists, women's rights activists, labor organizers, campesinos. All of these people are being targeted by paramilitaries that are linked to the government and that are linked to large landowners, large capitalists, and multinational corporations. So I, as a journalist, want to shed light on this. I think the entire corporate media should be talking about this. Instead, they're fixating obsessively on official enemies of the U.S. government, like Venezuela. And that hypocrisy is really striking to me, being here in the capital of Colombia and looking at the failed right-wing coup attempt in Venezuela. There's an obsessive fixation with Venezuela right next door, but almost nothing is said about the extreme violence going on right here in Colombia, a major U.S. ally, of course. The irony is that the Santos administration, which was also a right-wing administration, when they signed the peace agreement, it of course wasn't out of the kindness of their hearts. It wasn't because they necessarily want peace itself. One of the reasons they did it is because by ending part of the armed conflict, they could help further neoliberal development in the country and give, external contracts to multinational corporations. And I've been interviewing indigenous leaders, Afro-Colombian leaders in more rural departamentos here in Colombia. And one of the things that they're talking about is how, although of course it's good that the civil war has at least partially ended, although there still is violence, although that part is good, the downside is that now that the FARC and some of these communists have demilitarized, now the Ivan Duque administration is creating its own plan de desarrollo, its own plan of development, which is a very neoliberal right-wing plan that is allowing multinational corporations to mine resources on their land, which is leading to a lot of displacement of indigenous, Afro-Colombian, and campesino Colombians here. Also, we have seen the massive increase in monoculture production. So the thing was that these, guerrillas, the FARC and others, were essentially defending the land from multinational corporations. And now that they've demilitarized, multinational corporations have free access to exploit this area, and it's leading to not only violence but displacement. And in that way, a lot of people are, they're excited about the potential of a partial peace agreement, but they keep saying that the peace has not gone far enough. The government has not fulfilled all of its obligations under the already existing agreement. And the Duque administration is even more right-wing than the Santos administration and is following in the footsteps of the far-right Uribe administration that came before it.
Ben, online I've seen a lot of political leaders on the left there and trade unionists connecting the social problems faced there with the amount of efforts put forth by the Duque administration to cooperate with the United States and the Venezuelan opposition on military and other efforts near the border. Did you hear any of that during this week's protests?
Oh, absolutely. Venezuela has loomed large, largely because the corporate media here in Venezuela is obsessed with Venezuela, and the right-wing government has been exploiting this issue for years now. It's not new. Uribe launched his own kind of war on terror, and he tried to essentially say that anyone on the left was an accomplice, a narco-terrorista that was working with the FARC. So there still is this kind of war on terror atmosphere against the left here. The left is still very much repressed, and Venezuela is often used as a bludgeon to attack the left. So in the past election, in which Duque won, but he actually did not win by a large margin. It was much closer than you would think. And for the first time, you saw a left-wing candidate who was actually close to winning power, Gustavo Petro. And during that campaign, the Duque campaign and the corporate media tried to portray anyone who was against Duque, who was against neoliberal austerity and against the right-wing policies of the government, as supporters of what they called, hilariously, Castro-Chavismo. So people who were supporting Castroism in Cuba and Chavismo. So the idea is to lump everything in with Venezuela, which is the boogeyman, trying to portray everyone as if they're going to turn the country to what Venezuela is. And of course, here in Colombia, they portray what's going on in Venezuela as something that's the fault solely of the Venezuelan government and not of years of economic warfare by the U.S., of crippling sanctions, the most crippling sanctions the U.S. has ever imposed on a country, and of course of sabotage that has gone on again and again, and violence by the opposition. So those aspects, the sanctions, the economic warfare, the violence and sabotage, those are all ignored if you watch media reports here in Colombia or if you listen to the government speak. Instead, there's all this fear-mongering, and it's used to try to discredit the left here. And it is used to actually great effect, unfortunately. You hear a lot of people on the left talk about how it's so difficult to operate here because Colombia is almost kind of a neo-colony of the U.S., and the left, even though it is somewhat legal now, it's still grossly repressed. And under the Duque administration and the Donald Trump administration in the U.S., we have seen the alliance grow even tighter. And one final note I'll say is that I had a very interesting interview with a social activist here who's involved in the peace movement. And I asked him what he thought about President AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in Mexico, and his own development plan, which is a progressive development plan that could be juxtaposed against the right-wing neoliberal plan of Duque here. And I asked what he thought about AMLO in Mexico. And this activist here in Colombia made a great point. He said that the most important thing López Obrador is doing is trying to pursue a path independent of U.S. imperialism and showing that Mexico can forge its own political path. And this Colombian activist lamented, he said, unfortunately, here in Colombia, it's almost impossible for us to do that because the drug trade is, it's not up to us. The drug trade is controlled by the U.S. largely. It's not Colombians consuming the drugs. It's Americans from the north consuming the drugs, and the U.S. government fueling this war on drugs and this far-right terror campaign. So in many ways, all of these issues are linked, and U.S. imperialism is really restricting the Colombian left and preventing it from having more power.
Ben, you're now in Colombia, but you were recently in Venezuela. What was your reaction to the destabilization attempts we saw on Tuesday? And can you tell us a bit about the sort of things you learned while covering Venezuela from the ground?
I was in Caracas, Venezuela, and neighboring states in February and early March for about a month. And my trip showed, I knew before going, but my trip just conclusively showed that the corporate media reporting in the U.S. and Venezuela is not only ridiculous, it's simply full of lies. It's really, as a journalist, it's really shocking to me how low the editorial standards are on Venezuela, where journalists on CNN and other major corporate media can claim objectively false things, like there's no food, there's no toothpaste, there's no soap in Venezuela. There are all of those things. Now, of course, there are difficulties in the country, but why are there difficulties? Those difficulties are largely because of a campaign of economic warfare being waged by the U.S., of crippling sanctions from the Trump administration. And you can listen to the Trump administration itself and hear the colonial rhetoric that they're using. They're quite open about their disdain for not just Venezuela, but the Venezuelan people. So, for instance, John Bolton, the neoconservative national security advisor that Trump appointed, who's an architect of the Iraq War and has the blood of 1 million Iraqis on his hands, he has invoked the Monroe Doctrine, saying we are not afraid of mentioning the Monroe Doctrine. This is the 200-year-old colonial doctrine that the U.S. is now reasserting against Venezuela. And this past military coup attempt shows just how superficial the actual political movement that the U.S. is trying to put in power is. There is not much support for Juan Guaidó, this young right-wing opposition leader whom 81% of Venezuelans had never even heard of before he self-declared president on January 23rd. And of course, he did that not only at the request of, but really at the command of the U.S. government. We have reports in mainstream corporate media outlets acknowledging that the U.S. and other governments like Canada and right-wing governments in Latin America had been plotting this coup attempt, and they were the ones who chose Juan Guaidó as their supposed coup leader. Well, we saw this past week that he could only get 25 soldiers to join him in this failed coup attempt. I mean, it was frankly embarrassing. And if you look, the only victory they had in this failed coup attempt that was miserable was that they managed to release Leopoldo Lopez, the far-right opposition leader who has been implicated in acts of violence and numerous coup attempts. And what did he do? Leopoldo Lopez immediately fled to the Chilean embassy in Caracas. And then when the Chilean embassy said that they were too full and they kicked him out, he went to the Spanish embassy. So that was what they accomplished. The US-backed coup mongers did not take any territory because they don't have popular support, and there were virtually no defections. And all they accomplished was freeing this elite oligarch right-wing opposition leader who fled to the embassy of Spain, which colonized Venezuela and large parts of Latin America. So that is the perfect symbol for this failed coup attempt. They are right-wing oligarchs. They're descendants of the European elites who have family who are Harvard economists, and they're trying to work with the Donald Trump administration to overthrow one of the only progressive governments remaining in the region. And they're working with the far-right government here in Colombia that has the highest rate of assassinations of human rights activists, and with the fascist government in Brazil, which is also extremely violent. That is the situation. And anyone who looks at that internationally can see very clearly that this has nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with human rights. This is about right-wing policies, about exploiting Venezuela's natural resources, and about overturning one of the few remaining progressive governments in the region.
The Venezuelan Air Force has expressed its condolences to the family of Jackson Alexis Silva Zapata following his death. From the Twitter of the Bolivarian Armed Forces Aviation account, they tweeted, the General Commander of the Bolivarian military and civil personnel express our most heartfelt words of condolences to the family of Silva Zapata for the tragic and painful death of General Jackson Silva Zapata. We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back. The Spanish Supreme Court will decide whether exiled Catalan President Charles Puigdemont will be able to stand in European Union elections May 26th. The Electoral Commission had barred his participation, but a court overruled this decision, saying that it was an infringement of his basic right to stand. Two more exiled leaders from the Together for Catalonia party are also seeking to run. The Supreme Court is the same institution that's accusing Puigdemont of rebellion, raising concerns of judicial impartiality. The Catalan National Assembly and the Council for the Republic have presented a citizens' initiative asking that the Article 7 of the Lisbon Treaty be applied to Spain for having violated fundamental rights. This would mean the suspension of Spain from the European Union.
Catalans believe that the European Union is the best space in the world for freedom and democracy. It's not perfect, but to make it stronger, it needs all of us. We can't leave it in the hands of just some states. It needs us as citizens to be involved every day in the defense of democracy. As we believe that Europe is a place where citizens are protected, and not just the interests of the state, we appeal to the European Union that it allows, in an intelligent way, citizens to express the power they have in this union. Sadly, the Spanish state is impeding democracy in the European Union. As such, it's necessary for us to reinforce democracy in Spain as well. This is not a proposal against the Spanish state. Rather, it's in favour. It's in favour of reinforcing democracy, because reinforcing democracy in any state in Europe, including Spain, reinforces European democracy.
Yellow Vest protesters have rallied against the G7 meeting taking place in France. This is the 25th weekend of protests against the policies of current French President Emmanuel Macron. It comes after International Workers' Day demonstrations were severely repressed in Paris. Some Yellow Vests joined a rally against climate change in the northern city of Metz, where G7 environment ministers were meeting. For the second day in a row, Israeli forces have attacked Gaza, killing at least one Palestinian. Israel said that they had attacked more than 30 objectives using tanks and planes. Gaza's health minister said that 6 Palestinians were injured, and the Palestinian education minister said schools in the areas being bombed were being evacuated. Sirens were heard in various parts of Israel, and the anti-air Iron Dome system was activated to intercept missiles. Following days of violent protests, Benin's Constitutional Court has announced the definitive results of its parliamentary polls. Elections were held on Sunday, April 28th, without any opposition candidates and a turnout of about 27%.
Considering the irregularities and the disturbance during the vote, these are still not of a nature to compromise the validity and transparency of the vote. It is therefore necessary to validate the results.
Cyclone Fani has killed at least 12 people in India and caused substantial damage to infrastructure. Heavy rain in eastern India and neighboring Bangladesh prompted authorities to evacuate more than 3.5 million people to safety. The storm swamped towns and villages, damaging a hospital and phone lines. A train station was forced to cancel trips, leaving passengers stranded. This station became a temporary shelter for the displaced.
Feeling very bad experience that I was really afraid. Like first time I have seen such type of wind that is 220 km per hour wind. I have never seen such type of wind.
The brother of former Algerian President Bouteflika has been arrested along with 2 former intelligence service chiefs. They were taken into custody as protesters continue to demand that those affiliated with the former president are removed from power. Bouteflika's brother served as an advisor to the president for more than a decade and is believed to have held power in the country since the former president's stroke in 2013. Protesters gathered across Algeria for a last demonstration before the start of Ramadan. Many protesters gathered in the streets on Friday before the month of fasting began, during which they vowed to continue demonstrating. Protesters say that they do not trust anyone linked to the former government, including the interim president Abdelkader Ben Salah, who is serving as president until the election on July 4th.
They think we are going to be discouraged and that we will stop the movement. We will be there during Ramadan. We will be there for the festival of Eid and the sacrifice of the lamb. We will not stop.
We've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at tellustorenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Their English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.